Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I will apologize for the construction that has just started. As I'm sure you all know, we're in the midst of several huge capital projects, and it's a little hard to balance everything. But I think it will be fine, and we will just move ahead with everybody who's speaking, projecting. I am Diana Craig Patch, the Lila Atchison Wallace Curator in charge of Egyptian art, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2025 Charles K. Wilkinson Lecture Series entitled Untold Stories, Recognizing the People Behind the Art and Archaeology of the Ancient West Asian, Ancient Egyptian, and Islamic Worlds. This year's presentations by Isabel Stünkel, Allison Mickel, and Bernard O'Kane will highlight little-known stories and contributors to the field of Egyptian, Islamic, and ancient West Asian art and archaeology. And before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to tell you a little bit about the man in whose honor this program was created. Charles K. Wilkinson was part of the Met's staff for 66 years until his death in 1987. At that time, his friends endowed a fund that yearly supports this wonderful event. The lecture series provides scholars who specialize in the topics covered by our three departments: Egyptian art, the art of Western Asia, and Islamic art, as a venue, a place to share their expertise focused around a single topic. Charles K. Wilkinson joined the Met in 1920, and for 11 years was a member of the Egyptian expedition in Thebes, where he's best known for his work on as a graphic artist alongside Nina and Norman Daguerre Davies. The team copied ancient Egyptian tomb paintings, many of which are exhibited in Gallery 135, just outside the door. You saw them as you came in. In 1956, he was appointed curator of the Department of Ancient Near East and continued in that position even after it merged with Islamic art in 1959. He chaired both departments until he retired in 1963. He was also the Hagop Kevorkian Curator of Ancient Near East at the Brooklyn Museum and an adjunct professor of Islamic art at Columbia University. He was an active and respected scholar in all three fields, and in addition to our beautiful copies of Egyptian tomb paintings, his publication on the wall decoration from Nishapur remains an important study of that site. So in honoring his memory, I am pleased to begin today's program by introducing the first speaker, Dr. Isabel Stünkel. Isabel holds an MA and PhD from the University of Bonn in Germany. And before coming to New York, she worked as a curator in the University of Bonn in their small Egyptian museum. But since 2007, Isabel has been part of the curatorial team in our department and now holds the title of curator. Her main research interests are Middle Kingdom royal women, the religious significance and function of amulets, and questions regarding human remains in museum settings. But more recently, she has started to work with archival material from the old excavations of the Metropolitan Museum, and she will share that research today. She has been doing some very, very interesting things. Isabel?
Thank you. Let me just adjust the microphone. Can you hear me all well? Yes, okay, great, thank you. Hello. My talk today is about the Met's early excavations and the Egyptian individuals who worked on them. The title of the talk, Unearthing Legacies, has a double meaning. Ancient legacies were unearthed by the Met's early excavations, but the legacies of many of those who worked on these excavations are not known. The Western archaeologists who directed and participated in the museum's projects in Egypt are recognized, mainly through their publications. But what about the contributions of Egyptians who worked on these excavations? While the issues of inequality and colonialism are deeply entangled with the subject, they are not the focus of my talk. Rather, I want to make visible some of the Egyptian individuals who worked on the Met's early excavations and about whom little is known. In order to find traces of them and acknowledge their central contributions, one has to dig through the archives and unearth their untold stories, not among dirt or sand, but among papers. The research I'm sharing today is work in progress and based on archival material in our department, and this work would not have been possible without the help of Andrea Kutsenko, the archivist of the Department of Egyptian Art, who started about 2 years ago and is organizing and sorting through a massive archive, and Andrea Lakian, a departmental volunteer who works with the archivist. Having both of them in the department is really allowing us to sift through the archive and pull together documents that enables us to recover the identities of at least a few Egyptian individuals of the early Met excavations and to reconstruct some of their stories. In the archive of the Department of Egyptian Art are the original excavation papers, including thousands of photographs taken during the work, find records, correspondence, and other material, but unfortunately the records are incomplete. Related to Egyptians who worked on these projects, we have photographs, and you see some examples on the screen, personal letters from the Western archaeologists in which the Egyptians are mentioned, and a few letters from Egyptian individuals themselves, and unfortunately, only a few detailed accounts that list names. And then we also have documents that were given to the museum at a later time and were not part of the official excavation record, such as the guest book of Minnie Burton, who lived together with her husband, excavation photographer Harry Burton, in the Luxor Excavation House, or the personal photo album of Charles Wilkinson, the man in whose honor the Wilkinson Lecture Series is held annually. Charles Wilkinson was part of the Metropolitan Museum expedition from 1920 on as a member of the graphics section, as you've just heard, which documented monuments, especially Theban tomb paintings. So he knew and worked with many of the men I will be talking about. Even though our departmental archive is huge, altogether the records regarding the Egyptians who worked on the early excavations are sparse and only allows for a very incomplete picture, and it mostly comes from a Western lens. Research into Egyptian participants of early excavations in Egypt only started in the last couple of decades, and I want to acknowledge the groundbreaking 2010 publication Hidden Hands by Stephen Quirk. Other related research is now going on in many places, and a first conference on the topic at the Netherlands Flemish Institute in Cairo was organized last fall by Wendy Douillon and Marlene de Meyer. But let's get back to the Met and start with the when and where. The Metropolitan Museum's Department of Egyptian Art was founded in 1906, and one of its mandates was an ambitious excavation program to build a comprehensive collection through excavations. This was the plan that the archaeologist Albert Lithgow had laid out to the museum's trustees, who then agreed and hired Lithgow as the first curator of Egyptian art and as the head of this excavation program, which was called the Metropolitan Museum Egyptian Expedition. The first season of work began in the winter of 1906 to 1907 and included large-scale excavation work, which ended in 1936 at the time due to the financial problems created by the Great Depression. Additionally, extensive documentation of monuments took place, especially of Theban tombs, and this was the expedition's graphics section, which started in 1907, and the main work of which ended in 1937. The 5 main places that the Egyptian expedition worked at are indicated in bold on the map. Wadi el-Natrun, Lisht, Kharga, and Luxor, that is ancient Thebes, and Hierakonpolis. And Lisht and Thebes were really the main sites. I will be showing a lot of old photographs from the work at the temple of Hatshepsut at Del Bahari, and you see here a recent photo of the temple on the right. And 1906 to about 1944 is the time frame I will mainly be talking about. The excavations did not run continuously throughout the year, but always stopped for several months over the hot summer, and then work resumed in the fall. During several years, excavation work was going on at several sites at once, and the staff was split among them. The excavations were put in place to build a collection of Egyptian art. At this time, a system called partage, or division of finds, existed, no longer practiced today. According to the system, about half of the finds were given to the excavators, and the other half, and any unique pieces, went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The excavations made many important finds, and through the partage system, many spectacular works were brought to New York as part of the Met's growing collection of Egyptian art. As an example, you see here the famous Mecca models that were found in 1920 and already exhibited 2 years later in 1922 in the Metropolitan Museum. They are still one of the highlights of the museum's collection today. As a second example, I'm showing the statues of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, which were found in fragments, mainly during the 1920s, and to which an entire gallery is devoted in the Metropolitan Museum today. The excavations and all of the individuals who worked on them contributed not only to the museum's collection, but also to our knowledge of our ancient past, notably Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled a powerful empire about 3,500 years ago, is an inspiring fact of human history. One of the aims in going through the archival records is to retrieve information about the broader group of individuals and to acknowledge their contributions. Unfortunately, altogether, we don't have records that give in-depth information about the Egyptian excavation members, and we have to piece together from various sources, and the results are usually just glimpses. So I want to prepare you that the untold stories you will hear in this presentation are fragmentary. Altogether, there were hundreds of Egyptians who contributed to these archaeological projects, but most of my talk will be dedicated to a small number of individuals for whom we have more, but still only limited information. The American archaeologist and Met curator Herbert Winlock, who directed the Met's excavations at the Temple of Hatshepsut at Del Bahari, published a book called Excavations at Del Bahari in 1942. In the front of his publication is a list called The Staff at Del Bahari, but as you can see, only Western staff members are listed, and individuals who were crucial to the project were excluded, such as the 2 Egyptian Rices. And rice is an Egyptian Arabic word that is often translated as foreman, but as you will hear, these 2 men were much more than foremen. In other parts of the book, however, the 2 Rices are mentioned, and in a short passage, one learns how heavily Winlock relied on them. And I would like to apologize for possibly mispronouncing any names in the following, and I will probably say them with a strong German accent. So Winlock said, quote, "As long as the work had been merely the clearing of Naville's great dump, and Naville was a previous excavator, the dig had needed very little attention. Hamid Mohammed and Jilani Suleiman, with 22 years each, in the service of the museum's expedition, made a very good pair of boss workers, quite capable of managing the work with the minimum of supervision," end quote. Winlock is talking about the season of 1927 to 28, and with 22 years of service, it is clear that Hamid and Jilani joined in 1906, so right in the beginning. So let's look at what we know about the start of the excavations and the different types of work that the Egyptian team members were responsible for. For the first season of excavation work in winter 1906 to 1907, Rais Hamid Mohammed from the village of Kuft was hired. And this is the time when Kuftis, Egyptians from a village named Kuft near Luxor, had become the sought-after excavators. They originally worked with Flinders Petrie, who's often called the father of Egyptian archaeology, from 1895 on. And here I also want to mention that this is a living tradition. The knowledge and skills of the first generation of Kufti excavators have been passed down in the families, and many Rices and specialized team members on today's excavation projects all over Egypt are Kuftis, who by now are also joined by individuals from other places within Egypt. Getting back to the start of the Met's excavations, we know that Rais Hamid previously worked on the excavations of Petrie and the American archaeologist George Reisner, where he was an assistant Rice. When the Metropolitan Museum Egyptian Expedition was founded in 1906, Lithgow was the head, and additionally Arthur Mace and Herbert Winlock were hired. The latter eventually became the director of the Egyptian expedition. And according to a helpful 5-page summary about the excavations that Winlock wrote in 1937, it was actually Mace who brought in Hamid as the head rise for the start of the work. Mace, like Hamid, had worked both with Petrie and Reisner. And this summary also says that the Rais Jilani Suleiman, who was the second Rais of the entire expedition, started as a photography assistant for Winlock in 1906 at Lisht. And I will later talk more about the two Rises. From Winlock's short summary, we also learn that when the excavation first started, that Rais Hamid brought with him, quote, a nucleus of workmen who had had experience on different excavations and who were all personally known to both Mace and Lithgow. For 30 years, we retained Hamid, and with him, a gang from Kuft, varying in number from 20 to 50. These men were divided into companies, each with a head man. Whenever possible, we gave a definite area to each company and assigned a bonus for the objects found to the men by companies to be divided among them in proportion to their daily wages, end quote. And this bonus for finds is also referred to as the bakshish system. So in addition to the two main Rises, there were the headmen, which were basically assistant Rises, also from Kuft. It is also detailed that in addition to these specialists from Kuft, many men and boys worked on the excavations who came from the local areas surrounding the sites. So for example, from the village of Gona in modern Luxor or from Lisht. Winlock says, quote, at each site, we had a varying number of locals, men to dig and push the cars, there was a light rail system, and boys to carry baskets, end quote. And in the photograph here, you see some of the assistant Rises are standing and overseeing the work. So for example, the man at the top left corner, while other men excavate. Yet other individuals fill the baskets with debris, and young men and boys carry away the baskets to dump the contents. And for example, if you look at the bottom right, you can see some of them with filled baskets on their shoulder and some returning with the empty baskets in their hands. And I just want to add a little arrow here towards the top. And there is Rais Hamid standing in the center of the activity here, indicated by the red arrow. There were also more people who worked for the excavations, about some of whom I will be talking today, and these include the staff of the excavation houses, the driver, and the guards. Regarding the total number of individuals employed, it varied. It seems that the largest crew was used when huge old debris mounds were excavated. We learn how many people worked on it through correspondence, since Winlock regularly wrote letters from the Luxor excavation house back to Lithgow, who as department head at some point had to stay in New York. On December 17, 1927, Winlock writes, quote, the dig is proceeding. We have 665 on our payroll and are moving out 800 cubic meters per day. And this is about 28,000 cubic feet, so about 1/3 the volume of an Olympic swimming pool, or, according to my husband, the volume of 15,000 kegs of beer. So this was the volume of debris moved per day. The letter continues, quote, so far, we have only found unimportant chips, but that is expected as we're not touching the level under Neville's dump at all at present. It is far and away the biggest job that we have ever done. But with Hamid and Jalani in charge, it requires no attention except at bakshish and pay times, end quote. And then in a letter from nearly a week later, we can read that the number is now 703 individuals, which is the largest number I have seen. Unfortunately, we don't have complete pay lists with the names of this large workforce, and only occasionally some individuals are named in various contexts, for example, medical care. Here we have a letter from Winlock to a Dr. Mickel at the Luxor Hospital, and Winlock is sending individuals working on the excavations to him. The letter here mentions, quote, Abdel Hakim Shimi, a small boy who is in our work, end quote. We also get 8 more names of individuals in the list on the right, and we also have other similar short notes for the doctor where we learn about the various ailments from a dog bite to a sore foot. The letter we just saw referred to a small boy, and I mentioned earlier that for the manual labor, men and boys were employed. In fact, many children of various ages worked for the excavations. You can see this here in front of the temple of Hatshepsut. Child labor on excavations was very common at the time and practiced throughout Egypt. Our archival material includes a complaint by the Save the Children International Union to the Metropolitan Museum's director in 1929. It gives a 5-page long report written by a British visitor to Egypt, and we also have Winlock's 8-page long letter to the museum's director in which he provides a point-by-point answer. The most severe aspect of the complaint is the reference to what the visitor calls whipmasters, these being the foremen, who are said to use their whips to make the boys work faster, and the visitor writes that he observed how one whipmaster, quote, thresh some of the boys as if they were pigs, end quote. Winlock refutes the claim, saying that the whip is never used on the body of a person, and that, quote, it is perfectly well understood by all of our foremen that we would never tolerate any semblance of harshness, and I've never failed to investigate personally any boy's complaint of ill treatment. On the very rare occasions when I could discover any evidence of such ill treatment, I have demoted the foreman guilty of it, end quote. So while Winlock is saying that he tolerates no harshness, he admits that on very rare occasions, ill treatment did happen. Child labor in Egypt at the time is, of course, a very complex topic that I'm only touching on here, but I wanted to make sure to acknowledge that it was part of the museum's excavation work. In the following, I will mention many letters that the Western members of the excavation wrote, and I'm showing you here some of these people. The first head of the Egyptian expedition, Albert Lithgow, is in the top row, the third man from the left. At the top left corner is Herbert Winlock, who became Lithgow's successor in 1928. And we really learn the most from his letters. In the top row, the fourth man from the left is the photographer Harry Burton. And to the right of him is a young man, and this is Charles Wilkinson. This group shot was taken in Luxor in 1925 and also includes other Western members of the excavation. So between Winlock and Lithgow is the architect Walter Hauser. At the top right is the artist Norman Degaris Davis. And in the second row, the second woman from the left is the artist Nina Degaris Davis. And at the bottom left is the archaeologist Walter Klein. I would also like to point out the second woman from the right, in the middle row, who is Minnie Burton, the wife of Harry Burton, whose guest book we have in our archive. Minnie Burton kept a guest book while she was living in the Luxor excavation house, which you see at the top left. And her guest book includes many photographs, including the one we just saw with the Western members of the excavation. But more interesting for us today is the one here, and the caption says, "House staff with Bayumi, the chauffeur." In addition to the copy pasted into the photo album, we have a better quality loose print of this photograph, which I'm showing here, together with a close-up of the driver, who was identified as Bayumi in the album's caption, and from other sources we know that his name was Bayumi Rifai. We also have a loose photograph that belonged to Charles Wilkinson that is labeled on the back and says Bayumi at the wheel. But the remaining text is all about the car, a Ford that had to be registered as a bus, and the donor of the funds to buy the car for the excavation is quoted on the back as saying, "You can have a car, but not a Rolls Royce, mind you." Bayumi was not just driving around people, but he also transported finds. Here you can see how a large crate, probably containing a Hatshepsut statue, is loaded onto his car using a gigantic crane-like derrick. Standing next to the car and pointed out with a red arrow is Bayumi. And in the distance on the very right, by the way, you see a bit of the temple of Hatshepsut. But Bayumi was also driving money. Apparently, he was getting the pay money from the bank, and we learn about a horrible day in his life on January 28, 1931. which is when he was injured in a failed robbery attempt. The New York Times already reported the next day Luxor robbers failed to get museum pay. Apparently, Bayoumi had picked up the pay money from the Luxor Bank and was driving on the Memnon Colossi street when bandits hiding in a sugarcane field attacked the car with gunfire. But despite being wounded, Bayoumi speeded on and got away. In a letter Winlock wrote the next day, he starts off with, quote, "Hell has been popping here." And he reports, "Fortunately, Bayoumi is only slightly wounded. The heavy glass windshield broke the force of the bullets, and by miracle, nothing went into his eyes. I was up at the winch when they brought me word of what had happened and got back to the house to find him covered with blood. Foster and I got him into the brown car and rushed him right over to the hotel doctor in Luxor." End quote. Bayoumi's full name is given in the letter on the right that Winlock received from the trade unions of Egypt, thanking him for what he has done for Bayoumi, and I assume they mean his medical treatment, as this letter was already sent a few days after the attack. Through various other letters, we learned that the same bandits allegedly had killed a guard previously, and that in the end, several were killed by the police and others sentenced to 15 years in prison. One also learns that before Bayoumi worked for the excavation, he lived in Cairo and was the driver for a high official, the chief of the public security department. And a few years after the attempted robbery, Bayoumi stopped working for the excavation and moved back to Cairo. And in this 1938 letter from him that he sent to Burton, it is clear that he now has an address in downtown Cairo, and he says that he is, quote, "always busy between Cairo, Alex, meaning Alexandria, and Suez," end quote. From another letter that Burton wrote in 1938, we learn that the name of the new driver is Ahmed Lufti and that he is, quote, "a success so far." Looking again at the house staff photo, we can identify the cook through his hat. And even though the caption does not give his name, through a reference letter, we can say that this is probably Farahat Ibrahim Ali. Luckily, the copy of this 1931 letter of reference was kept, and it says that Farahat Ibrahim Ali worked as a chief cook for 8 years. This means since 1923, so he was working for the excavation when the group photograph was taken, and the man with a chef hat can thus be identified as likely being him. The reference letter says that it was necessary at the time to economize, and the assumption is that a less experienced cook was hired for a lower salary. And this seems to be Hamada Mohammed, and we have a letter from him that he sent to Harry Burton. And here it is very interesting to learn that he's from Balas. And this is a village very close to Kuft, so also close to Luxor. But this village is close to Kuft, where Rais Hamid and Rais Gilani and many others are from, and it's just on the other side of the Nile. Hamada also appears in an estimate of costs for season 1936 to 37. And in a letter from 1937, we also learn that Hamada has health problems at the time that are not specified, and that there are fewer people to cook for, which might improve his health. And in 1937, excavation work has stopped, and only a small team is working on documentation. Other members of the house staff were also from the village of Balas. Mohammed and Mahmoud Edab, likely brothers, occur in a letter from November 1926 in which Winlock addresses a governmental official. Apparently their home in Balas was searched by the police, and Winlock requests more information and says that these two young men have been employed as house staff since exactly 20 years, since they were little boys, and that he cannot believe that they were involved in the crimes they're suspected of. Since it is 1926 at the time, and they have been employed since 20 years, it means that they started to work for the excavation from the first season on. Winlock also makes a second inquiry after Mohammed Edab was apparently hauled away to be fingerprinted. The outcome seems to have been okay, as we learned through the estimate of costs for 1936 to 37 that you just saw earlier, that both men were considered for work 10 years after this incident. It also shows that they worked as house staff for the excavations for 30 years. We have the names of many individuals who cannot be matched with people shown in photographs or paintings, and we have the opposite as well, as in the case here. As you heard before, Charles Wilkinson copied tomb paintings as part of the graphics section of the excavation, and in his free time, he painted and sketched landscapes and people, and among his work are these two paintings you see here, and a third one you will see later. They are portraits of two Egyptians that worked for the Metz excavations, but unfortunately, the knowledge of the names of these two individuals was lost over time. Wilkinson had these two paintings in his home, and after his death, they were given to Christine Lilliquist and Bill Barrett, and we're very thankful that they gifted them to the Department of Egyptian Art. In addition to the paintings, we also have these drawings that Wilkinson made. They were given by Wilkinson's widow, Ilma Wilkinson, as gift to the museum in 1991. So like the paintings, they are later additions to the excavation archive. Unfortunately, the individuals here are not identified. However, this drawing has a caption. This is Waziri Abdelaziz, who was portrayed in 1926. A waziri occurs as a member of the house staff in several documents and is likely the person we see here. Waziri also occurs in the estimated costs for 1936 to 37, and then in a pay list of the summer of 1938 that you see here, and unfortunately, we only have a couple of these detailed pay lists. I wish we had similar records for every year. This list shows that he worked as a summer guard when no excavation was going on. House staff and others were employed as summer guards for the excavation house in Luxor. The question was actually raised in a letter about how best to keep some of the individuals in service over the summer when no actual excavation work was happening, and this appears to have been the solution. In a letter from 1925, we also learn that Winlock decided that year to keep the summer guards on a shorter rotation, but to employ one more for each rotation. He writes, quote, "In order to give employment to as many men as possible, I have cut the term from 2 months to 6 weeks and increased the number of men from 4 to 5 on each turn. This may sound extravagant, but I think it's worthwhile, and it gives a chance to help out some of the people who've had no work to do at all this winter," end quote. And let's go back to the group photograph. The additional loose print we have has a caption on its back that is slightly different to the caption in the guest book. And it's very interesting as it says servants and camera boys. So it was not just house staff who are in this picture, but also photography assistants. The latter are usually referred to in the old records as camera boys, no matter what age they are at that point, which of course is denigrating, and not the term we would use today. Winlock's 1937 excavation summary, from which I quoted earlier, is also very interesting in regard to photography, as he wrote, quote, "Each European member of the expedition working in the field had assigned to him 2 or 3 native boys to carry cameras, help in surveying and in photography. Some of the photographers particularly became very skillful. Many of the boys remained with us down to the present," end quote. The fact that Winlock calls them photographers here shows that they did not just carry cameras or serve as human-sized scales, which is how they often appear anonymously in photographs, but that they actively participated in the actual photography and probably in printing. And here I also want to make clear that when I use the term photography assistant, I am including the active role of taking photographs and making prints. The excavations photographer Harry Burton is well known, mostly through the fact that the Metropolitan Museum loaned his services to Howard Carter so that Burton, with his assistants, photographed the finds from the tomb of Tutankhamun, which is what you see here. Christina Riggs, who researched Burton's work on Tutankhamun in detail, studied the Burton correspondence in our archive and found in a 1941 letter of Burton's widow a reference to an individual named Hussein who did camera work, as she called it, with her husband. Until recently, Before sifting through other archival papers, this was all that was known, a photography assistant called Hussein. But in our archive is also a 1909 to 1910 photograph of a young man with the caption, Hussein Bakri, Kufti Camera Boy. The same individual also occurs in records from 1936. In the estimate of costs from the 1936 to 37 season, Hussein Bakri is listed as one of 3 photography assistants. And by the way, the spelling of Bakri with an A or U is just a common variation in the transliteration from Arabic into English. So in 1936, about 26 years later, the same person who's shown in the 1909-1910 photograph is still working in this role. And it is the expedition photographer Harry Burton who made this estimate. So far, the only detailed record I've seen that gives names for the photography assistants. Here we also learn the names of 2 others in this position, Lisa Selana Mohammed and Abdel Hadi. The name Hussein also occurs on the back of a 1920 photograph that shows Burton photographing the monastery of St. Macarius. And in the foreground, unfortunately with the back to us, are 2 individuals named Salim and Hussein. This is probably Hussein Bakri, and Salim might be another assistant. There's also the famous photograph of the coffin of Merit Amun with an Egyptian man standing beside it. I wondered if this is one of Burton's assistants, who of course would have been with him while he was photographing, and Burton often seems to have used his assistants as a scale. When we look in our archives, the records are not always what one is hoping for. You can see the whole photo board here, and the caption says Tomb 95, Outer Coffin of Merit Amun, and the individual is not identified. Looking in the photo registration book, the entry is not helpful either. It gives the tomb number, says that this is the coffin of Merit Amun, and then just says lit with a man beside it. But we know that the photograph was taken in 1929. But going back to the photograph of house staff and photography assistants, one does wonder if the person on the left in this group shot one wonders if the person that you see next to the coffin of Merit Amun on the left might be in the group shot. And there is indeed one man in the bottom row that might be the same person. And if this is correct, then he might be Selena Mohammed or Abdel Hadi, who were listed by Burton as photography assistants together with Hussein Bakri. But we don't know, and this is really just a possibility. Now I would like to talk about a very specific task that went on for many years and concerns a group of works that are really among the highlights in the Met today, the statues of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. In the beginning, you saw the photograph on the left of the Sphinx of Hatshepsut that is currently displayed next to the Temple of Dendur. And I mentioned that most of her statues were excavated in fragments, and that was between 1923 and 1932. This meant that these statues needed to be put back together. On the right is the head of the Sphinx when it was assembled from dozens of fragments. It was an enormous undertaking to piece back together these sculptures. The Met curator and archaeologist William Hayes was tasked with this work, and from letters we learn that an individual named Mohammed Mahmoud worked closely together with him. You see here the simple tables where thousands of statue fragments are laid out, plus also some larger kneeling statues being put back together with the help of the crane-like derrick. In a letter from December 1927, Winlock reports, quote, "Last night we found a bit of the shin of a statue, and both Mohammed Mahmoud and I immediately began to wonder whether it belonged to ours or not. Apparently it doesn't." End quote. The fragments of many statues were mixed together, and I have the highest respect for the men who worked on piecing them back together. Just imagine someone had taken like several dozens of three-dimensional puzzles, removed a bunch of pieces, and then mixed them all together. And that several of the puzzle pieces are so heavy that you cannot lift them by hand to see if they fit, but you have to use a derrick. In a letter from 1930, when even more statue fragments were found, we learn that Winlock, quote, asked Hayes to start work on these statues, and he will take Gilani and Mohammed Mahmud, end quote. So we also know that Rais Gilani was involved in this work. And from one of the photographs that I will show later, it is clear that Rais Hamid was part as well. Unfortunately, the man you see here working on the Hatshepsut sculpture fragments were not named, and only William Hayes, the foreigner on the right with a hat, can be identified. But one of the others is possibly Mohammed Mahmud. There's also an interesting letter that Winlock wrote in January 1932, right after he became the director of the Metropolitan Museum, and when it is clear to him that he cannot return to excavate in Egypt. He writes to Ambrose Lansing, his successor as head of the Egyptian expedition, and says, quote, please tell Hamid and Gilani and Mohammed Mahmud and the others that the thought of leaving them almost made me throw over this job, end quote. The fact that Winlock gives Mohammed Mahmud's name together with that of the two Rises shows Mohammed Mahmud's important role. Mohammed Mahmud came from Kuft. We know this from a letter that he sent to Winlock in November 1936, in which he's asking for work. And at this point, there is no longer excavation work happening, and the Kuftis had been told to look for other work. It is unclear if Mohammed Mahmud received work the same year, but we know that he did so later when the house was still kept in business and when documentation was still happening, as his name occurs in documents from 1938 and 1939. This is a time when barely any work is happening anymore, and he's employed as a guard for the excavation house. We also learn that he suggests to paint the excavation house and then does so. But now let's move on to the two Rises. Fortunately, we have a photograph of each of the two men who wrote their names in Arabic on the front. These two photographs belonged to Charles Wilkinson, and he later gave them to the Department for Archives. So they were not part of the original official excavation records, but entered the archive decades later, and they are so precious to have. Wilkinson might have taken these photos himself. So this is Rais Hamid Mohammed Abdallah, and the text on the back was written by Wilkinson. As said earlier, Rais Hamid was the first writer for the museum's excavations from the first season on in 1906, and he remained the head Rais throughout. We know he worked for Flinders Petrie before 1906 and apparently also for George Reisner, according to a document in the Reisner archive, for which I thank Peter de Manuelian. The only other photograph that identifies him with a caption is this image that also came from Wilkinson, who had put it in his personal photo album where the caption on the right says Rais Hamid. You saw this photograph briefly earlier when I talked about the Hatshepsut statues being put back together. None of the individuals we see here are named in the photo registry. It just says, working the derrick on the kneeling statues. But if we zoom in, we see a now familiar face on the left. When one compares this photo with that of Rais Hamid, there is no doubt that the man seen here on the left is Rais Hamid. One does wonder if the individual on the right might be Rais Gilani, who's known to have worked on the statues, but one does not really see enough of the face to determine this. It could be the two Rises working together here, but we simply don't know. So the estimate of costs for the 1936-30 season, you saw earlier the section on the photography assistants, we learn about their wages and that Rais Hamid made 25 more than Rais Gilani, leaving no doubt about the hierarchy. We have several letters from both Rais Hamid and Rais Gilani. They are usually in English and mainly deal with accounting, bank business, and payment, such as the letter on the left from 1930, while the example on the right is a general letter sending greetings. It is noteworthy that the letter on the right was written in the summer of 1936, when it was clear that there would be no excavation work in the winter, which was, of course, a heavy loss of income, as only some of the Kuftis were kept employed. After Winlock's retirement in 1939, he seems to have occasionally exchanged letters with the two Rices. We have two letters from 1944, one from each Rice, that are written in both English and Arabic, and in these letters, Hamid and Jilani sent general greetings and thanked Winlock for a letter they received from him. The most recent letter we have is from 1948. This is the year the excavation house in Luxor was completely closed and handed over to the Egyptian government. In this letter, Rice Hamid addresses Lansing, the then head of the Department of Egyptian Art. The letter is signed as Hamid Mohammed Abdullah, and it does not just say Kuft underneath his name, but also the more exact region of Awadat. Hamid says that he worked for the museum for 43 years and that he is now 67 years old, which means that he was born in 1881 or 1880, and that he was 25 or 26 years old when he started to work for the Metz Excavations in 1906. It seems that Rice Hamid had been employed by the museum until the closure of the excavation house, and that a lump sum was paid as a retirement to the Rice, which was much smaller than what he had expected given the length of time he had been employed by the excavation. Rice Hamid says here, quote, "Of course you know very well what they paid me, and moreover you know the time which I passed, and you can compare between my age and that simple reward, which does not agree with an old man of 67 years, unable to find any other hard work," end quote. End quote. And he's then asking for the museum to consider paying him more. I do not know what became of this request. The second most important individual working on the Met's early excavations was Rice Jilani Suleiman. This photograph of him was labeled on the back by Wilkinson, and Rice Jilani started in 1906 as a photography assistant for Winlock, and eventually must have worked his way up as to an assistant Rice, and then became the second head Rice. Oh, no, not yet, sorry. Letters from 1920 from Arthur Mace, a museum archaeologist working in Lisht, reveal that Jilani was likely promoted to second Rice that year, and that it was Winlock who made it happen. At the time, excavation work was going on at two sites simultaneously, in Luxor in the south, and then also in far-away Lisht in the north. Winlock knew that the museum's director was coming to Egypt and that he would need to spend a certain amount of time with him, so he wanted to put Rice Jilani in charge of the Luxor work and sent Rice Hamid to Lisht. There seems to have been some tension between Winlock and Mace. Letters of Mace show that he rather wanted to promote one of two other Kufti assistant Rices named Hilali and Seman, but in the end it was Jilani who was promoted. One of Wilkinson's drawings that doesn't give a name can be identified as Rice Jilani through this photograph, but we do not know when this sketch was made. Likewise, this painting by Charles Wilkinson can be identified as Rice Jilani through the photograph. It is unfortunately undated as well, and we're very grateful to Christine Lillequist and Bill Barrett, who gave this painting to the department, and who also at the time knew that this was Rice Jilani based on the photograph. But what else do we know about Rice Jilani? In 1909, he gets arrested for not having a train ticket. Apparently by 1920, he has a blood feud with people in Lisht. In 1927, he had a very bad case of pneumonia, and Winlock fears the worst, but Jilani recovers. Regarding his responsibilities as a Rice, he did not just oversee the excavation work. From Winlock's letters that he writes to New York with reports about the work, we learn that Jilani was also responsible for packing objects, presumably for transport to the US. Like Rice Hamid, Rice Jilani started on the first year of the Metropolitan Museum's expedition in 1906, but Jilani did not start as Rice, but worked his way up, and he stayed until the end of the Met's early excavations, likely until the excavation house in Luxor was closed in 1944. But we can trace Rice Jilani's work after his time with the Met's excavations as well. He went on to work as a Rice for an American archaeologist named Frank Albright in Yemen from 1951 to 52. Together with another Kufti Rice named Shatir, he is acknowledged in a publication by by Albright, who apparently hired 6 Kuftis. While we don't have concrete evidence, we can reconstruct how Rice Gilani ended up working for Albright, because Albright was one of the so-called monuments men and women who worked during and right after World War II, mainly protecting and returning art that the Nazis had stolen. And Albright here is in the center of the bottom photograph, to the right of the Da Vinci painting, which he restituted to Poland. The connection of Albright to Rice Gilani probably came through James Rorimer, who was also a monuments man. Rorimer was a curator for medieval art at the Metropolitan Museum, and thus a colleague of Lansing, the archaeologist who had worked with Rice Gilani and was a curator at the Met at the same time. Rorimer thus knew about the excavations in Egypt, and it was probably through him that Rice Gilani was referred to Albright, though we have not yet been able to find any correspondence about this. Both Rice Hamid and Rice Gilani were really not just foremen. They were expert archaeologists and excavation managers. They knew how to handle and transport heavy objects. They knew how to lead a huge group of people. They hired staff. They did accounts over the summer and arranged all kinds of things. They also knew how to handle local politics, which should not be underestimated. In a letter to Winlock from 1931, Ambrose Lansing writes back to in a letter to Winlock from 1931, Andrews Lansing writes, quote, "I told Gilani about your idea of discharging one of the local guards, and he seemed much disturbed. He came back later and said that if it were all the same to you, he would rather that one less Kufti should be kept on duty here in the summer, and that the present number of Gonawis, so people from the local village of Gona, should be maintained. His theory is that as long as we have members of the 3 important families of Gona drawing wages, there's less likelihood of trouble," end quote. This is another example that indicates how central the 2 Rices were for the successful run of the museum's excavations, but they were not the only crucial members. As you have heard, many Egyptian individuals worked on the Met's excavation and documentation projects. I hope reconstructing some of their untold stories will enable us to acknowledge their central contributions. And that when we marvel at some of the works of art in the Metropolitan Museum, we think not only about the ancient Egyptians who created these objects, and not just about the well-known excavation directors and Western archaeologists who should be acknowledged as well, but that we recognize the many Egyptians who worked on these projects, especially Rice Hamid and Rice Gilani, without whom the Met would not have the amazing collection of ancient Egyptian art it holds today. Thank you.
We're going to take a 5-minute break before the next speaker starts, okay, which will be at 3 o'clock. All right, so you've got 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. So as we're right at 3 o'clock, we're going to start up again with our next talk. Thank you, Isabel, for that wonderful and fascinating investigation. And welcome to the next lecture of the series. My name is Sarah Graff, and I'm a curator in the Department of Ancient West Asian Art. It's my pleasure to introduce my department's invited speaker, Professor Allison Mickel. She's currently Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Lehigh University, where she's Director of Global Studies, and also a core faculty member in Lehigh's Center for Global Islamic Studies. But in 3 weeks, she will be the H. Bruce McEver Chair of Archaeological Sciences and Technologies at Georgia Tech, where she will be starting a new archaeology program. So we are truly fortunate to get her in this moment of transition, and very excited to see that archaeology department that she creates from the ground up. Professor Mickel received her BA from the College of William and Mary and her PhD in anthropology from Stanford University. She has excavated in Jordan, Turkey, Kenya, and the United States, and is now undertaking an NEH-funded ethnographic project centering on 2 new private companies in Jordan that advocate for the recognition of local expertise and fair labor conditions on archaeological excavations. Her research focuses on how local communities have impacted and been affected by the long history of archaeological work in the Middle East. In 2021, she published an important book, Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent, A History of Local Archaeological Labor and Knowledge, which was recognized with the G. Ernest Wright Award by ASOR, the American Society for Overseas Research. The book focuses on how archaeological excavations rely on the expertise that locally hired laborers possess about archaeological remains and methodologies, and I can attest that it's both rigorous and fascinating. In addition to numerous publications in peer-reviewed archaeological journals, Professor Mickel is also the author of the book Archaeologists as Authors and the Stories of Sites, Defending the Use of Fiction in Archaeological Writing, published in 2012. In addition to her scholarly work advocating for more inclusive practices in archaeology, Allison Mickel is also an active public anthropologist, writing for newspapers and online platforms, volunteering with the organization Skype a Scientist, reviewing educational material for organizations like the Boy Scouts of America, and organizing annual outreach events with local public schools for Anthropology Day. So I'm very much looking forward to her talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mickel to the Met for a talk titled The Campfire Excavation, Bedouin Stories, Memories, and Archaeological Knowledge.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for being here. The theme that we are invited to consider today is untold stories, to think about the workers who touched the objects that are now in these halls before they were ever cleaned and displayed. In fact, when they were at their dirtiest, maybe barely even recognizable. These workers may have been the first to touch these objects and fragments in thousands or even tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, if we close our eyes and imagine maybe a Neolithic person taking off a bone pendant necklace and setting it down, we imagine the dirt covering that necklace and millions of sunrises and millions of sunsets passing until the dirt is brushed off of the pendant for the first time and a worker lifts it up. If we think about that, we can almost see the original wearer handing their necklace directly to the excavation worker lucky enough to be digging in that spot. And yet, in the Middle East, the excavation worker who is the first to discover the object may never record their observations or impressions anywhere. Whether because of language barriers, dig hierarchies, or a lack of training, locally hired site workers who have done most of the dirt moving in the history of Middle Eastern archaeology have rarely been included in the documentation, analysis, or publication of archaeological sites and assemblages. The result is an archaeological record that is partial and incomplete, an archaeological record that lacks some of the most important data about an artifact's context and provenance. And I think for a long time, we as archaeologists have tended to confuse a lack of published or recorded perspectives from workers with a lack of expertise or interest on the part of workers. But just because our documentation methods and protocols were designed to exclude workers' perspectives doesn't mean that those workers have no stories to share. In fact, their stories are still alive and still burning. When we think about untold stories, I want to invite us to ask, untold to whom? Untold to the archaeological archives, maybe. But if you'll sit with me for a while in the sand, join me in placing some sage and juniper on the embers and start to listen to the crackle, I think we will find a whole different archaeological record, one that operates by the rules of the desert campfire. I work in Petra, Jordan, where archaeologists have been conducting excavations for more than 100 years. You may have heard, if you know about Petra, that the site was discovered by Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt in 1812. But of course, that story tends to erase the people he spoke to who led him through the monuments, the Bedouins who had been living there for several hundred years. It was the Bedouins he encountered there who showed him the iconic monuments of Petra. We call the treasury because it's a translation from El Khazne in Arabic. The monastery is Ader, or the monastery, in Arabic. These names are folk knowledge that we've retained even after archaeological investigations have indicated alternative or sometimes earlier purposes for these monuments. When George and Agnes Conway started excavating in Petra in the 1920s, they hired members of the same Bedouin community to assist in the digging efforts in the area known as Wadi al-Farasa. The workers you see here lived in the caves, tombs, and on the farms around the Petra area. Excavations in Petra continued over the course of the 20th century, including Martha Jakowski's excavations at the Great Temple and Philip Hammond's projects at the Nabatean Theater and later the Temple of the Winged Lions. There have been projects by German, Swiss, Polish, Danish, French, Italian, American, Jordanian, British teams, and more, each one employing often dozens of workers from the local community. Over time, archaeological research projects in Petra have proliferated, and today there are around 24 ongoing simultaneously, as you can see in this display in the Petra Museum. What this means for the Bedouin in Petra is that there have now been hundreds of projects and 100 years of scientific inquiry which they have seen and in which they have worked. A century of supporting excavations by digging and sifting and sorting artifacts, but not just that, also by housing artifacts, housing archaeologists, feeding them, doing their laundry. What's more, jobs on archaeological projects have tended to flow within families, from father to son, or brother to brother, or cousin to cousin. Can you imagine the stories these families hold about how archaeology really works? How much more could we know about the decisions made by the research team, about the methods they used, about the artifacts they found, if we could just join one of these families for dinner? Or maybe for a picnic in Beida, the area just north of Petra where families hang out on the weekends brewing sweet tea and cooking bread. For that, we'll need a fire. I'll grab the wood. Beida is this area just to the north of Petra, which is often called Little Petra because it has its own rock-carved facades and preserved wall paintings, though none as monumental and grandiose as those in what we might call Big Petra. I went there to meet a man who I had heard had worked on many archaeological projects in the region. I got there in a taxi with my research assistant, and I got out with my research assistant, Iman, and we walked up to the only goat hair tent visible in the landscape, and we tentatively asked for Abu Ghassab. A tall, older man shuffled to the entryway and directed his kids to make some tea on the fire. When the tea was ready, he offered us 2 glasses, which we happily accepted, and then we could talk. Yes, he told us, he had worked on a number of archaeological projects. I started asking him some questions about his memories and experiences when soon his son, Ghassab, came over and started answering for him, at times even interrupting to clarify his father's answers. And at first, I was annoyed. We were here to talk to Abu Ghassab, and it felt a little bit disrespectful to listen to his son's more confident words over Abu Ghassab's quiet, slow to unwind memories. Ghassab, though, revealed that the reason he was so invested in the conversation was because he too had worked on archaeological projects. We had found one of the dynastic archaeology families of Petra. As Abu Ghassab recalled his time as a younger man working on excavation after excavation, we could see his fingers recalling the feeling of the tools, the artifacts, the soil. He told us that an excavation might be slow to start, but the black sand is where you really start finding things. Yes, said Ghasab. That's because the black sand is Roman, because of the fire and the destruction. Then the white sand a meter down is Stone Age. I took a breath in. Just a couple of years before, I had been part of a survey project in this very area of Bela, where we had used ground-penetrating radar to detect structures under the soil. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending signals under the ground which bounce back when they hit something dense. It's one of a whole suite of technology that archaeologists use to predict what's underneath the soil before we start digging, because archaeology can never be redug. It's destructive. We destroy the layers of soil as we dig them. And so because of that, there's a lot of effort expended in archaeology to try and predict what we're going to dig before we start, to try to estimate what we're likely to find before we ever excavate, and in trying to know how deep we're going to have to dig. I would say this is arguably one of the most lively areas of innovation in archaeology today. And I'm not saying that Abu Ghasab and Ghasab are replacements for these technological approaches, but clearly, this father and son, and probably others in their family and their community, had noticed and discussed their observations of the stratigraphy, the soil layers of the area around Petra. The mystery of what we might find when we start to dig is not so mysterious to a family of archaeological workers. As we were poured more cups of tea, Ghasab continued to tell us about the archaeological projects he had worked on in the region and how they differed from one another. He told us which projects had been the most precise and scientific and which ones just seemed to be trying to dig quickly. He recounted especially fond memories of working with Hans Gebel, who is a prominent archaeologist focused on Neolithic sites. But he had criticisms of the institutions and organizations charged with the caretaking of the Petra archaeological zone. It's bad, he said, when they use the bulldozer. One time they used it at a cave just like the one Diana excavated. He was referring to Diana Kirkbride, another archaeologist of the Neolithic who worked in Jordan from the 1950s to the 1980s. Ghasab told me that the bulldozer crushed the remains of an ancient arch and an ancient bench in the process of the excavation. This is a problem with UNESCO and the park, he said. Ghasab's charges are especially significant in light of how Middle Eastern populations were historically described by archaeologists, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. European and American explorers, colonial administrators, and researchers alike all echoed a same basic claim that local populations didn't care about archaeology, artifacts, or history. It was this premise, this idea of local apathy, that first justified the removal of artifacts from this region and ultimately colonial claims to the land itself. This same premise of local apathy justified the instantiation of research methods that excluded local workers, whether through language and literacy barriers or hierarchies in roles or technological learning curves. Local workers' perspectives aren't missing in archaeology by accident. Their exclusion from the archaeological record is an outcome of political priorities and underlying social beliefs that local communities would have nothing to say about archaeology, which created a self-fulfilling prophecy. If locally hired workers didn't seem to care, then archaeologists didn't need to ask them what they thought. But having never been asked what they thought, there is no record of them knowing or caring. The stories seem untold. But here Ghasab was telling stories that demonstrated anything but apathy. He had both knowledge of and a sense of duty toward the archaeological remains. He wanted them protected and preserved, and he had noticed and was upset when they were damaged. Maybe this, the evidence of local communities' affection for their cultural heritage, is the real untold story. During the tourist low season in November, I found myself in Petra, in the shop of Dakhlala Samahin, just past the Nabatean Theater in the basin of the city center. Dakhlala was, as always, generous with his time and space in the shop and had offered me the nicest bench available. The teapot was on the fire, and he was telling me about the need for more archaeological work in Petra. Only about 25% of Petra has been uncovered, he impressed upon me. But the problem is finding someone to excavate the rest. The problem is money. In walked an older man, Abu Khalid, who was immediately handed a cup of tea and a lighter to light up his cigarette. Dakhlala told me that he, Abu Khalid, had worked on archaeological projects too. You know, Dakhlala said, as if it was just occurring to him, there's a Byzantine church here above the dam. Where? Asked Abu Khalid with interest. Dakhlala explained the area he was talking about up higher on the trail from where we were sitting, giving some landmarks that Abu Khalid recognized immediately. Abu Khalid nodded as he inhaled on his cigarette. As if offering a trade, Abu Khalid explained to Dakhlala and me how to tell apart the phases of construction at the Qasr al-Bint, a Nabatean temple in Petra, not quite visible from where we were sitting. Some parts of the wall, he told us, were visibly Nabatean, where others were Roman or Byzantine repairs and additions, in addition to the modern restoration work that was clearly apparent. Dakhlala nodded, and now that it was his turn again, suggested or reminded, maybe, that underneath the paved Roman road in Petra, below that there's a Nabatean road. Abu Khalid wanted a more precise direction, maybe 2 meters down, he said, tapping his ash. They agreed that very little in Petra is originally Roman and continued to exchange hypotheses of where a future archaeologist might find a new Nabatean structure, whether underneath a Roman structure or in an under-investigated part of Petra. And I'll admit that at the time, this exchange didn't really stand out to me. This was constantly happening to me in groups. People would trade ideas about where they would like to dig, where I should dig, what we might find there. They offered possible locations for a Nabatean bank and a school and houses and residences. I noted it all down, but my goal wasn't to start a new excavation, and I didn't want to give false hope of future employment, so I didn't get too excited or visibly excited about these suggestions. Maybe I should have, though, because after all, every time we find a new structure in Petra, it's really big news. I don't know if anyone remembers this discovery in the fall last year of 12 individuals in a story of the treasury in Petra that hadn't been uncovered yet. Or before that, in 2016, this report of a structure found hiding in plain sight. And these finds were absolutely exciting, and they will advance our understanding of Petra and of life in the Nabatean kingdom. But it was surprising to me to see these reported as stunning discoveries. As others have acknowledged, both of these were known and described by members of the Bedouin community for years before they were reported as discoveries. This is not to discount the scientific work that led to the systematic mapping or excavation of these monuments or of other sites in Petra. But it does feel a little bit like a repeat of 19th century history, like Burckhardt 2.0, to say that these were previously unknown remains. They weren't unknown to the shop owners, the tea drinkers, the campfire builders. And maybe in a few years, when the New York Times reports the discovery of a new Byzantine church in Petra, you, me, Dakhlala, and Abu Khalid won't be so stunned to hear about it. Abu Khalid also told us that he had a lot of experience in conservation. He told one story of participating in a project doing some mosaic repair, and he critiqued projects that had applied highly visible and permanent conservation solutions like cement. But he hadn't just learned from the projects that he had worked on. He also had shared his own knowledge of the sandstone and the local climate with the people leading these projects in order to protect the remains. On one of the projects he had worked on, one of the researchers named Dr. Salim found a column. Abu Khalid said that Dr. Salim said the column was going to be a problem because it was so salty. They didn't know how to do anything about it, and they asked him how to fix it. Abu Khalid said, I used a method where I wrapped it in a newspaper to draw out the salts. I left it overnight, and I removed it the next day. They were amazed, he said, to see how the newspaper peeled back and how the salt fluorescence had disappeared. Salt, meanwhile, is widely cited as the #1 threat to conservation in Petra. Salt enters stone through water in which it has dissolved, and as the salt crystallizes, it breaks the material around it. We are constantly looking for solutions to address this in Petra, where the sandstone carved facades are always eroding, and sometimes entire tomb facades have been known to collapse. But these problems aren't unique to archaeology. Bedouins lived in the tombs and caves of Petra for generations, and the salt affected the structural integrity of their homes for those generations. Here, according to Abu Khalid, was a project where they had been open to applying and receiving that knowledge. But what I really noticed as he told his story was that Dakhlala was listening intently. Yes, I was there to ask about archaeology, and I had initiated this conversation. But how many teapots and campfires had workers sat around at the end of a long day and shared their observations of what the archaeological team had done or not done? How many times had this sort of conversation happened and not been written down anywhere? We have so much more to learn about this environment and how to manage it. Abu Khalid was clearly someone who cared about archaeology, which is something he continued to emphasize as he and Dakhlala talked about what artifacts could still be found in Petra and which were elsewhere. As they built their list, they lamented that some of the most famous statues found in Petra were no longer there. The famous Al-Uzza idol from the Temple of the Winged Lions, Dakhlala said, was somewhere. He didn't know where, but it wasn't here. Abu Khalid had worked with Dr. Crystal Bennett on her 1960s excavations on top of Al Biara, one of the tallest peaks in Petra, famous for its inaccessibility. Of those things he remembered excavating 50 years earlier, Abu Khalid said that most of those things were sent to the museum. Now they're in the museum in Jerusalem. You can't find them in Jordan. It sounded like he had gone looking. Not all campfire stories are true, of course. Sometimes we're telling each other ghost stories or legends. And this one in particular sounded like maybe Abu Khalid was using the museum in Jerusalem more as a metaphor for a place inaccessible to himself than as an actual facility containing these objects he had excavated. But it wasn't a metaphor. Abu Khalid was right. I was stunned that he had known and remembered what happened to these specific artifacts so long ago after all the projects he had worked on. It was astonishing to me that here he was telling this story that not only demonstrated his deep care for the archaeological remains of Petra, but also a level of insight and knowledge into aspects of the archaeological process I wouldn't have expected him to have, almost by design. Here I had come to Petra specifically to find out what former site workers knew about the archaeological process. And even I had imagined that they couldn't be expected to know about the movement and export of artifacts beyond Petra and outside of Jordan. I took it as a rejoinder I didn't think I needed, almost an admonishment not to underestimate site workers' knowledge and expertise. Maybe I had fallen into the trap myself of believing in silences that only seemed silent because we hadn't been listening in the right places. I came back to the conversation to find Abu Khalid ranking the quality of work done in Petra by teams from different nationalities. The best conservation, he said, is by the French, and the Germans are second best. Without a hint of malice, Abu Khalid said frankly that the Americans are not good. When I asked why, he said, Americans have their own rules. Nobody follows these rules but them, and they don't like being told what to do. They like to tell everyone else what to do. With the Americans, Abu Khalid said, I can't express myself. I only speak when spoken to. Okay, so this was a little embarrassing, but it was also important to hear for several reasons. One was that it illustrated that whether or not we accept that Bedouins are exchanging stories containing expert archaeological knowledge, which I hope I've shown you that they are at the very least exchanging stories about us, about their excavations with foreign archaeological teams. They are definitely, at the very least, telling stories of how they were treated, of the impressions that we've left as human beings. And this might seem like a minor issue, but with an increasing recognition of the role that archaeology and archaeological work plays in foreign diplomacy and international affairs, it really is very significant. Archaeological sites have always been locations of cultural exchange, and how we interact with people on the ground has real ramifications for broader scale peace and diplomacy efforts. It affects our ability not just to travel safely, but to be welcomed in the places we want to visit and explore. And I think, especially in this moment, in 2025, of deep uncertainty about the future of international geopolitics, Abu Khalid's observation that Americans follow their own rules resonates particularly heavily. These interactions, impressions, and stories also have consequences for the science of archaeology and what we are ever going to be able to know about the human past. Abu Khalid had, at this one fire, told me two contrasting stories. One where his conservation method knowledge was welcomed and implemented, and a second where he had decided to shrink himself, not to speak until spoken to. Which project do you think operated more effectively? Which one benefited from greater dialogue and better, more informed decision-making? This last story from Abu Khalid made clear to me that what we consider untold stories remain untold not simply out of habit, but in part due to how we arrange our archaeological excavations and how we approach our research projects. I was lucky to be an American he entrusted with his hypotheses about where to dig and how to approach salt fluorescence. But many projects had created a culture of silence, a culture of suppressing the sharing and utilization of this knowledge. This is no way to do archaeology. We have to start doing archaeology founded on the sharing of stories and perspectives, even if they conflict or compete with one another. Like Abu Ghassab and his son, or like Dakhalala and Abu Khalid, archaeology should look like people layering their observations, memories, and ideas, and seeing what comes out of the combined filter of all of these different lenses. But how do we do that? How do we do campfire archaeology? To answer that question, I want to tell you one last story. Many families in the Bedouin community of Petra raise goats. It's a dying art. Fewer families live in goat hair tents during the summer, and the influx of grocery stores and cheap cow's milk, along with the reduction in grazing lands, have made it more expensive to raise goats. But some families still have large herds of goats, and if there's been enough rain, they'll take the goats out to graze on the sometimes scant greenery in Petra. And if it's been wet enough, the female goats will return with their udders full, and Bedouin families can milk the female goats. They will then churn the milk until it makes zibde, or butter. They'll skim the butter off the milk and use it right away, or store it for cooking later. They'll then heat what remains of the liquid until it separates into a thick, creamy yogurt and a watery substance called mis in Arabic, or whey in English. There's nothing further to do with this whey, and so they'll throw it away. And for years, Bedouin families have told one another a funny observation that if they throw this whey on the sand near their tent, and if they try to dig there later on, maybe to put in a fire pit or to install some fencing, the ground will be so hard that they can't dig easily through it. The mis seems to turn the sand into stone. Why is this story important? At the campfire today, we've already talked quite a bit about the fragility of Petra's monuments. They are made of sandstone, which is a sedimentary rock comprised of silicate grains bound together. Our main problem for conservation in Petra is that salt, along with wind and rain, is constantly in the process of turning sandstone into sand. But this Bedouin story makes it sound like mis, this cast-off byproduct of goat milk production, might have an almost magical sounding potential to do just the opposite. One way that we might do campfire archaeology is to test that out. So in 2023, we began preliminary testing of this idea. The experimentation is being led by Sila, a Jordanian nonprofit company founded in Petra. We have been working together to test whether the casein in Goat Way might offer a sustainable organic tool to mitigating sandstone erosion in Petra. So we joined a family as they milked their goats and churned the milk and skimmed the zibda and poured the rest into a container and lit the fire and separated the yogurt from the whey. We tested 7 different types of sandstone from Petra, soaking them in different formulations of the whey and applying different metrics to see how the whey changed the structure of the sandstone. We are still working on this project, and I'm hoping we'll have some more definitive results to report on soon. I'm excited about it, though, for several reasons. Not only the potential to support the preservation of Petra's sandstone, and not only to create a possible new economic stream for Petra's remaining goat herders, but also to offer one example of what campfire archaeology might look like, of combining the science and methods of archaeology with the knowledge constantly being shared over bread and tea and embers. Without listening to and participating in this storytelling and story exchange, we miss out on knowledge about where we might find new sites and structures, or what we might expect to find when we start to dig. We fail to recognize how much local communities care about the destruction and removal of their cultural heritage. We risk continuing to perpetuate an extraction of objects from the context that they come from, divorcing them from both the stratigraphy and the stories that help us make sense of them. And we lose out on locally informed insights into the threats and interventions affecting the preservation of various materials and archaeological remains. And ultimately, if we lose out on all of this, archaeologists will only have ourselves to blame, because these stories aren't actually untold. They are constantly being shared and exchanged between people who care about one another's memories and experiences. As archaeologists, especially as archaeologists inheriting a reputation of being unwilling to listen, we just have to figure out a way to earn our place at the campfire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was fascinating. I don't know much about Jordan, so that was really, really interesting. We have a few minutes now before we start our next lecture at 4 o'clock, so you have a nice break to be able to go out and come back, okay? I will see you all at 4 o'clock. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mariam Ekhtiar, Patty Cadby Birch Curator in the Department of Islamic Art. It's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker today, the esteemed scholar and professor, Dr. Bernard O'Kane, and we are delighted to have him with us all the way from Cairo. Bernard O'Kane is professor of Islamic art and architecture at the American University of Cairo, where he's been teaching since 1980. He formerly worked in Iran as assistant director of the British Institute of Persian Studies. He's also served as a visiting professor at Harvard University and the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of 11 books, including Studies in Persian Architecture, The Mosques of Egypt, and Early Persian Painting, Kalila wa Dimna, manuscripts of the late 14th century. He has edited 3 volumes and co-edited 2 others, the most recent of which is inscriptions of the medieval Islamic world, and he has authored over 80 papers in journals and edited books. The title of his presentation today is Celebrating the Uncelebrated, Craftsmen and Designers in Islamic Art and Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. O'Kane to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can we have the first slides on, please? Here we go. This is a painting done in the late 15th century of an event that took place about a century earlier, the building of the Friday Mosque of Samarkand by a team of workmen for the ruler Timur, or Tamerlan as he most is commonly known in English. So there's a lot going on here. There's a supervisor wielding a stick, encouraging the people carrying the bricks to work a little bit faster. At the top we have the carpenters working, one with a plane, one with an adze, another sawing. Further down below we have some of the stonemasons carving patterns in the stone. There's also one elephant among those 95 which Timur brought from India, which are helping carry the huge blocks of stone. Then at the bottom right-hand side, we have mortar being mixed in a pool of water from a person carrying water in an animal bag skin. It's being filled into these hods, which the workmen are carrying up to the bricklayers on top of this arch. There's an awful lot going on here. And in fact, the workman wielding the stick is important because when Timur came back from his long campaign in Anatolia and Syria and Iran after 4 years, he found that the building still wasn't completed and in fact was too small to reflect his magnificence, so he had the two supervisors executed. What the painting doesn't show, however, is an architect. And that's not surprising. It's rare indeed for one to be mentioned, but when that happens, he was usually referred to as a mohandis, an engineer, with the implication that he was skilled in surveying. And there's only one architect in the Timurid period that warranted mention in the sources, Qavam ad-Din Shirazi, who signed his name prominently in this building, the Friday Mosque of Gohar Shad in Mashhad in northeast Iran, on the main Iwan of the building, where he's listed in his full name as Qavam ad-Din ibn Zainuddin Shirazi at-Tayyan. The last word means the plaster worker, perhaps indicating that he rose through the ranks from a much lower status. And in fact, he's also responsible for one of the most superb madrasas in the Islamic world in Khargir, the village in northeast Iran, where in an inscription at the back of the Iwan, he's referred to as al-marhum, as the late Qavam ad-Din Shirazi. So he died when this building was being constructed in the date here, 846, equivalent to 1442. The sources regarding craftsmen in Mamluk Egypt also indicate a variety of social levels of those involved. And at the top were the emirial supervisors of works, usually referred to as Shad al-Ama'ir. The notion that they might have had any hand in the design of the building was rejected until recently. However, it's been established that the supervisor of works in this building on the left-hand side, the complex of Sultan Hassan in Cairo, dating from the middle of the 14th century, we may have a different situation. This is a particularly interesting building. It's an enormous complex which included in the center these 4 halls which comprised a Friday mosque. In the corners, there were 4 madrasas, and there's a mausoleum behind the Qibla Iwan. It's one that was so large that they needed craftsmen from all over the Mamluk Empire in Egypt and Syria. And we're going to look at a couple of details first from the entrance portal that you see here. And there's a very interesting little detail of the ornamentation that is in this area here. This has some decoration which is hitherto unprecedented in Carian architecture. It's one which matches very closely what you see on one of the bottles that is on display in the galleries above the big hall right above us, a Chinese 14th century bottle, in fact, which has peony decoration, and that's reflected in the chinoiserie decoration on the outside of this. So how would that have happened? Well, in fact, in this period, most of Asia was under the control of one big happy family, the descendants of Genghis Khan, who ruled all the way from the China Sea in the east, almost as far as the Mediterranean on the west, including one of the sons, Hulagu, who founded the Ilkhanid Empire in Iran. The Mamluks who controlled Egypt at the time had been warring against the Ilkhanids for quite some time, but in 1330 they made a peace treaty, and from that period the goods that had previously been flowing across the Silk Road from China to Islamic countries further west now were able to come into Cairo as well. There's another interesting detail just around the side of the portal here, which is this extremely dense geometric pattern. It's also one that you see nowhere else on any monument of Cairo. But it's clear when you look at something like this, which is from a Seljuk monument in 13th century Anatolia, that workmen from that area had also been employed in the complex in Cairo. I'm going to show you a couple of details from the courtyards here in one of the corner madrasas, followed by some of the decoration in the main prayer hall within the monument. This is the Hanafi madrasa in the courtyard, and we have a very interesting stucco inscription that runs all the way around it. At the top you see a detail of this lower area, and it has the word katabahu, meaning he wrote it, he was the calligrapher. It gives his title, the Shad al-Amar, or the supervisor of works, and then his name, Muhammad ibn Bilik al-Muhsini. And the style of this inscription, which is also that present in the Qibla Iwan, there is one view of it with the main prayer niche, the mihrab in front of it. And here's another view of it with a detail. The style is rather unusual. It's in a style called Eastern Kufic, which was much more common for ornamental headings in Qurans at the time. The tops of the letters, instead of being circles, as in the usual cursive script at the time, they come together in a little pyramidal point in many occasions. Where else do we have this? Well, the top three are examples from the Sultan Hassan complex, but the bottom one, as it says here, is from the heading of a Quran that was calligraphed by this very same name that we found in the Madrasa, Muhammad ibn Bilik al-Muhsini. So he was an exceptionally cultured emir responsible for the construction of this, and it's very likely that he played a major part in designing the ornamentation of this building. However, a much lower status is indicated by the wages that the mimar, which is the normal translation we have in Arabic for the word architect, received for his work in this building, the complex of Kite Bay in the Northern Cemetery of Cairo. According to the endowment deed, we know that he received 200 dirhams a month. Now that's just the same as the murachim, the person who was responsible for the upkeep of the marble work in the building. and that much less than the doorkeeper, the bawab of the building, who received 300 dirhams a month. And a similar story is told by the endowment deed of this slightly later complex of Al-Ghawri in Cairo, dating from the beginning of the 16th century. There are the two mipmars, each received 200 dirhams a month, identical to the salary of the plumbers and those in charge of the marble. But in this case, the duties of the mimar are stated: to look after the building, to estimate the cost of repairs, including materials and workmen, and to oversee any demolition, layout, and construction involved. And clearly, this is a very different status from our contemporary meaning for the word for architect. So the mimar in that case, apart from his own skill as a craftsman, he also operated as a contractor. And an interesting parallel was recorded in this building from Seljuk, Anatolia, which is a caravanserai made by the Emir Jalaluddin Karatai, dating from the middle of the 13th century. This magnificent building had also included his own mausoleum that you see here in the background. The patron, when he was brought the account book and found that more had been spent than provided for in the estimates, rather than have the master craftsman make up the difference, he generously destroyed the accounts. And this shows that the master craftsmen were normally obliged to estimate the building costs and fund the difference of any overrun. So those were figures about whom we have some information from texts. But the vast majority of knowledge of craftsmen comes from the works that they signed. The frequency of craftsmen's signatures varies widely in the Islamic world. They appear regularly in Anatolia and Iran, for instance, but they're considerably rarer in Egypt and Syria. But still, there are enough connections between families of artisans who sometimes worked locally and traveled considerable distances, showing how the fame of their expertise spread. So, for instance, I'm going to be showing you works in particular from a shrine in this little town of Bastam. This is the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea, which will help you orient yourself perhaps. And I'm going to be mentioning the town of Damran, which is situated some 100 kilometers to the southwest as well. So this was a family of local renown, the Damrani family, a father and two sons who worked at this shrine. The father, Hussein ibn Abi Talib, and his son Muhammad, they both signed the carved panels on the inscriptions of this tomb tower, which was built for the son of the reigning Sultan Ul-Jaitu in the Ilkhanid Empire. And you can see some of the details of where they signed their name at this point here. The son Muhammad also signed one of the inscriptions on the main mihrab inside the shrine. You can see some of the details of his signature here, beginning Amal, the work of. And here on the left, we have this magnificent tile decoration at the entrance to a corridor. The corridor also has some magnificent stucco work. And this is signed to Amal, the work of Muhammad, the son of Al-Hussein al-Jassas, the plaster worker, literally. There is yet another mihrab in a very small hermit cell, which was used as a place of retreat within the complex. And just opposite it, facing it, is the inscription which tells us that it was the work of Muhammad and his brother Haji. And his brother Haji also signed an inscription in a mosque which has now disappeared in Damran. So this was interesting in that it shows us that the same craftsman could work in carving both brick and plaster, and they probably came from the town of Damran here while working in the shrine at Bastam. That's a relatively short distance, but we're going to look at this larger distance here, where a family of workers seem to have been involved in designing the plasterwork on another 3 prayer niches or mihrabs. The one on the left-hand side is from a shrine in Isfahan, the Imamzada Rabia Khatun. The one on the right-hand side is in a shrine at Turbat-i-Jam, which is near the northeast of Iran. And the one here is from the town of Natanz, which is a little bit closer to Isfahan in the northeast. But the signatures, in fact, have names indicating they're perhaps the same. In this case, it's Masoud Kermani. Kerman, in fact, is another town which is very far from either of these. It's in the southeast of Iran. They may have learned their craft there or come from a family that was based there originally. And here too, the signature of the craftsman is also Masoud Kermani. This is from, on the right-hand side, the work of Haydar Kermani. So they all seem to have been connected by family, but also the very naturalistic type of floral decoration that you see in both of these mihrabs indicates very likely that the same workmen were involved. And as I said, this is a much larger distance involved of many hundred kilometers between all of these sites. This is the main Iwan or prayer hall of a madrasa in a small town of Zuzan in the northeast of Iran, dating from the early 16th century. Sorry, from the early 14th century. And at the time this was built, this had the most advanced decoration in tile work probably in the Islamic world. I'm going to show you just a detail of this area here. This is the first monument in which we see the use of dark blue, turquoise, and white together. Now, in subsequent decades, we don't have any activity of this in Iran, but instead we have major advances in Anatolia. This is the detail of tile work which is made from pieces of cut tile. They start off with a square tile. They cut it out and they placed it on a plaster background. Originally, the plaster would have been white and you would have had a much greater color contrast with the dark blue, the light blue, and this kind of purple is made from manganese oxide, which if it's concentrated is jet black almost, but if you dilute it, it gets this purple shade. So these details of the tile work in this building, which is the tiled madrasa, the Sirchali madrasa in Konya, dating from 1240. These are on the facade of this Iwan in the building. And just around the corner from here is what I'm going to show you in the next slide. It's the name of the tile worker again, introduced by Amal, the work-off. And we have the name of Muhammad, the son of Muhammad, the son of Osman, al-Bana, or the builder, at-Tusi. He's from Tus, in other words, and Tus, in fact, is the name of a small town in northeast Iran, very, very far from Konya, where this building was built. Why? Well, I talked about one great happy family earlier, but in fact, if you weren't a member of the ruling class, you may not have been quite so happy, since when the Mongols threatened to attack a city, they were quite happy if the inhabitants surrendered immediately, but if they didn't, they usually massacred the entire inhabitants, which of course meant that the economy was in a disastrous situation after their attacks, and many of the most able craftsmen in Iran may well have emigrated to find work in Anatolia, where the Mongol advance hadn't quite reached yet. One of the most exciting examples of tile work is that of luster, which is a technique that involves 2 firings. It's a very difficult technique. The first firing has to, some cases, last over a week. The second firing is done in a reduced atmosphere, one which sucks oxygen out of the atmosphere. And when you apply a metallic oxide, the oxygen that is removed leaves an invisible sheen of metal on top of the tile, which has a wonderful reflective quality, hence the name luster. This was so difficult that it was only practiced in a few places in the Islamic world, starting off in Cairo, then in Raqqa in Syria, and in Iran only in Kashan. And in fact, it was so famous that the name for tile in Persian and in Arabic is Kashi or Kashani, derived from the name of the town. Some of the most impressive examples are these very large mihrabs. I'm going to show a series of 6 of these. These 2 were in the shrine in Mashhad in northeast Iran, the same place where we saw the signature of Qavamuddin Shirazi, the architect, earlier. And these date from 1215. Then there are another couple, one that was made slightly later for the same shrine, another one from a great mosque in Kashan, which is now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. And then another one from the Shrine of the Little Saint in Varamin, just south of Tehran, and another one made from for a shrine in Qom in the 14th century. Here's a table which shows the dates of these mihrabs that I've just shown you, together with their original and current locations. But this also gives the name of the makers of these, which is inscribed on the mihrabs. So we have Muhammad ibn Abi Tahir. In this case, we're not quite sure, but we also have the son of Muhammad ibn Abi Tahir making 2 of the mihrabs, and then Yusuf, his son, as well. So we have a whole family dynasty recognized in this series of wonderful examples of tilework. And there's another wonderful example of luster tilework that's on display in the gallery upstairs, which is this piece, which is probably the top of a grave cover from the shrine of Abd Samad in Natanz. Now, sadly, this town has been most in the news recently because of the bombing of the nuclear enrichment facilities there, but perhaps fortunately the nuclear enrichment site is several kilometers away from the village with its wonderful shrine, so I'm hoping it has remained undamaged. But in the spandrel of the arch at the top here, we have the name of Hassan, son of Ali, Babuya the builder. So this is the person who was responsible for the work of this luster. But an interesting feature is that just in the top of the plasterwork inside this same mausoleum where the cenotaph top was that I showed you in the last slide, we have the same name of the craftsman. So in addition to craftsmen being able to work in plaster and brick, they were also able to work in luster tile work and in plaster as well. So quite a lot of versatility expected from them. In later centuries, although this was a wonderful example of tilework, the luster ones that we have seen, it fell out of fashion. It was very difficult, very expensive to make, and it was superseded by the art of tile mosaic. I showed you an example of this earlier, the signature of the architect Qavamuddin Shirazi. These photographs on the right were taken in a tile workshop in Herat about 10 years ago, where they start out with solid tiles and they cut very painstakingly the tiles into these small shapes. The pattern is drawn on the ground. They place them upside down, and then they cover all of it with mortar, and finally they hoist the whole panel onto the wall. Turning now to woodwork, we're looking at some objects that could be sent long distances. We have several instances, for instance, of mimbars, these wooden pulpits being made in one city and assembled in another. The earliest known is what you see here in the screen, the mimbar of the Qutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh in modern-day Morocco, which was made in Cordoba, 800 kilometers away in 1137. And in fact, it and the mimbar of the Cordoba Mosque, the latter hasn't survived, they were famous as the finest of their age. Not surprisingly, as you can see from the wonderful details of the inlay and the wooden carving here. Another masterpiece was the mimbar commissioned by Nur ad-Din in 1169 for the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This was begun in Aleppo, but wasn't finished until 1175, shortly after his death. But at that time, Jerusalem was under the control of the Crusaders. And so it wasn't able to be moved to the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem until 1187, after Salah ad-Din had captured the city from the Crusaders. The signatures of 4 craftsmen are recorded on it. And one of the craftsmen who's mentioned is Salman ibn Ma'ali, a craftsman who was presumably his relative, Ubayd, known as Ibn al-Ma'ali. He was the chief artisan of another masterpiece of woodwork, the cenotaph of the tomb of Imam Shafi in Cairo that you see here, which was actually also donated by Saladin or Salah ad-Din in 1179. In the inscription containing his name, Ibn al-Ma'ali also asks for prayers for all of the carpenters, the Najarin and the carvers or designers, Naqashin, who worked on this cenotaph, which underlines how the great amount of detailed work on it must have been a collaborative project. In this case, however, the cenotaph was made in Cairo rather than transported from Aleppo. The stylistic connections actually of the foliate carving that you see in this detail from the Cairo cenotaph, they're really quite different from the detail of the Aqsa mimbar that you see on the bottom. And these are a couple of details from some other woodwork that is in the shrine of Imam Shafi in Cairo. And I put these up just to show you the difference that a coating of paint can make to an original pattern. At the top is part of a frieze that runs around the interior of the mausoleum of Imam Shafi. And in fact, you see 2 versions here of the same frieze after it was repainted in subsequent restoration campaigns. It's obviously much, much more easy to make out the design of the arabesques when it has been repainted like this. On the right-hand side are a couple of details of an inscription that runs all around the interior of this same mausoleum. It was recently restored, but unfortunately they seem to have run out of money because there's no distinction here in the background decoration behind the letters between a floriated scroll and the background itself. I digitally restored the floriated scroll in a different color here, and you can see again how much easier it is to make out the background when it is colored in like this. So when you're wandering around the galleries upstairs, just keep in mind, for instance, when you're looking at some of the stucco panels that are now plain, that they probably would have been painted originally and been much easier to see. This is actually part of the galleries upstairs as well, made by Moroccan craftsmen when the galleries were designed just over a decade ago. I don't know if the Met ran out of money or they forgot to suggest it, but the patterns actually would be much easier to see if they had painted them. These 2 mimbars are unusual in that they don't have craftsmen's signatures, but we know who made them. They're from 2 smaller mosques in Cairo, that of Ghamri and Abu Bakr Muzzer, dating from the late 15th century. But a biographical dictionary of famous notables, Sakhawi's Adawa Lama, he tells us the name of their maker, Ahmed ibn Isa ad-Dumyati. And he also tells us that he made a mimbar for the Haram, the shrine in Mecca, which would have probably involved also traveling and reassembling it there. His son, Muhammad al-Atta, was a preacher and scholar, and it may be this connection that may have been the reason why, exceptionally, Ahmed ibn Isa was selected for inclusion in this historical text. Now, for Muslims, the most important art or artistic endeavor is calligraphy, because this is the skill which you use to copy the Islamic holy book, the Quran. And in fact, it's for calligraphers that we have the most information in historical texts and frequently in manuscripts as well. This is one of the most important early examples. It's a Quran that's now in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, which is dated to 10,000 and was made in Baghdad by the calligrapher Ibn al-Bawab, who is famous for his introduction of this kind of cursive script, replacing the more rectilinear Kufic script that was commonly used earlier. This is an example in another Quran dating from 1307 from Baghdad. And we know, in fact, the name of the calligrapher of this, Ahmad ibn Suhrawardi, and the illuminator as well, Muhammad ibn Aybak. So this is one that's on display. Another interesting question is the transfer of designs. Who made the designs that were employed by craftsmen? And if they didn't make them themselves, how were they transferred? Although paper was known from the beginning of Islam, the advent of less expensive varieties in the medieval period certainly made recording and transmission of design more convenient. There are many inscriptions on monuments in different media that end with the signature of the calligrapher. And while sometimes, as on the lustered tiles that we looked at earlier, these may have been made by the artisan, major examples such as foundation inscriptions in buildings were probably drawn up in the chancery beforehand and then given to a master calligrapher to draw on paper. One interesting example of this is in the Herat Friday Mosque, which was being restored in the late 15th century, when one of the most famous painters and calligraphers of the time, Khaji Mirak Naqash, was employed. This is a painting which is attributed to him in a late 15th century manuscript, which is now in the British Museum. Now, he was commissioned to write the inscriptions for the mosque, but he was so late that he was likely to be fined for this, whereupon, having heard of this, he retired to his house and, we are told, didn't emerge until 15 days later when he had finished the job. And this inscription, which is in the Herat Friday Mosque, is probably due to his work. This is a very interesting document. It's a petition from the head of the library of a Timurid prince, the grandson of Timur, in Herat. It's from the head of the library that he employed. And it tells us what all of the workers in the library were employed on. But there's one very interesting extract from it, which says that this particular Persian, Khaja Abdurrahim, he's busy making decorative designs for binders, illuminators, tent makers, and tile makers. So what sort of designs would have been suitable for all of these different media? Well, probably arabesque designs like these. Now, in fact, this petition and this page of drawings, they're both in albums that are in the Topkapi Saray Library in Istanbul. The albums contain workshop drawings from the Ilkhanid period through the major dynasties in Iran up to the early Safavid period. And when the nomadic rulers of Iran at that time traveled around, they normally traveled with their treasury in the baggage train. However, when the first Safavid Shah, Shah Ismail of Iran, lost in battle to the Ottomans, it's very likely that the workshop drawings were in the treasury and were captured and taken to Istanbul, where, fortunately for us, they are still preserved. And in fact, another wonderful scroll that is preserved in the Topkapi Library is our earliest example of a pattern book that would have been used by craftsmen and architects. So this has one that is or two of them, in fact, that are based upon little squares for drawing up square kufik, a type of rectilinear script, which is used for common inscriptions. And on the lower half here, you can see the unfinished design in a 14th century shrine in Turbati Jam in eastern Iran, which has this squared out area, which was probably designed for one of the Kufic inscriptions that you saw in the earlier album. At the top, we have another detail of a painting that is in the Istanbul albums. And the lower part consists of a cursive inscription with a spiral scroll behind it. The upper part has a Kufic inscription, this rectilinear script. And you can see, in fact, in this unfinished version that they have just detailed or inked in part of the Kufic inscription. And you can see the compass marks where they had the spiral scroll ready for the background of the cursive inscription that was to go in the lower part of the panel. Another problem was, how did tile makers decide where the original tiles were to be placed on the monument? They were made in the workshop, which wasn't necessarily right beside where the monument they were going on to was to be placed. This is the entrance to the shrine of Najmuddin Kubra in Old Urgench, which is in the country of Turkmenistan. And we're going to look at a detail of this panel, which at first looks like one complete piece of solid tile work, but in fact it's so beautifully made that what you don't notice is that it's made of individual hexagonal tiles. But then when you look closer, you can see that they have numbers on them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so all the way up. And they also have Aleph, Be, Pe, Te. So this is an alphanumeric way that they discovered in the workshop that would help the workers place the tiles on in correct order. What is surprising, in fact, is that this was so rarely used in the Islamic world. The only examples I've found have been in this particular town and in one that's fairly close to it, the town of Khiva, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan, but geographically not very far from this one. And the examples at Khiva all date from the 19th century almost. This is one pair of spandrels at the top of an arch. Now, I don't have enough close-up detail to show you the labeling of the tiles, but in fact, I've marked them out here. And what's interesting is that they start upside down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in rows, going all the way up to 51. So if the tile panel is laid out flat on the floor in front of you in the workshop, it doesn't really matter if you're working right side up or upside down, as long as the tile workers could recognize it, they were able to reconstruct it accurately on the monument. As regards signatures of painters, they are very, very rare for a long time. In fact, I don't know of any illustrated Arab manuscripts that has the signature of the painter on the page. But fortunately, we do know the names of some of them. How? Well, it's because in the colophons, the little bit of writing at the end of the manuscript where, if you're very lucky, they tell you who wrote it, where they wrote it, and at which date. Sometimes they say, as in this occasion, which is from a manuscript of the Maqamat, a series of stories, they say that it was written by Bakhat, and we have Wasowarahu, and the illustrations were by the same person. This, in fact, is from an early 13th century manuscript. This is a fascinating page from it, which shows a woman on a birthing stool, just about to give birth, and two people who were arranging a horoscope for her. The very first example that we have of a signature in Persian painting, for instance, is in this manuscript, which is also one of a major life event, a marriage. The women of the handmaidens of the bride here are proudly holding up the blood-stained sheet, showing that she has just lost her virginity. while the husband is celebrating in the hall outside with musicians and dancers. And in this detail of the inlaid glass window at the top, we have the name of the work of Junaid, the royal painter. So that's the first example. This dates from 1396. It was done in Baghdad in a Persian manuscript. The original is now in the British Library. But even over 100 years later, in another very famous manuscript, perhaps the most famous of all in Persian painting, the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, that was done for the Safavid ruler Shah Tahmasp, possibly the greatest painting in the manuscript and one of the greatest of all time, there is no signature on the page. It's only, in fact, because of a later preface to another album, I should say, done by a painter who gave us a history of the painters of Iran. We know that Nizamuddin Sultan Muhammad painted a picture in the Shahnameh of people wearing leopard skins, and very poetically he tells us that the lion-hearted of the jungle of depiction and the leopards and crocodiles of the workshop of ornamentation quail at the fangs of his pen. Praise indeed. One of the most interesting aspects of Sultan Muhammad's paintings is something that you won't notice at first sight, but if you have a look carefully at the details of the rocks on the left-hand side, you'll begin to notice one of my favorite features of Persian paintings, which is rock faces. So that's a detail of this little area here, this very small area in the painting. Lots and lots of these little faces for you to see. Another little detail of this small area in the top, and we have a plethora of rock faces visible here too. And the Metropolitan Museum is very fortunate to own, I think, 15 or 20 pages from this same manuscript. Some of them are attributed to Sultan Muhammad as well, including this one, which is on display. And they have a wonderful system whereby you can sit at leisure and enjoy perusing the paintings in order to see features like these. So if you haven't done that already, let me encourage you to do so. Only perhaps a little bit later did it become common for painters to promote themselves and their painters. A very interesting example is this one of Bichitr, the painter at the Mughal court at the time of Jahangir. This is a very interesting album painting which shows the Emperor Jahangir framed by his sun and moon halo. It's too blinding for one of the Cupid or the putti that is at the top of the painting. He's presenting a book to a Sufi sheikh. And in fact, the caption in Persian tells us that he prefers the company of holy men like this to that of kings. We have shown further down the Ottoman Empire and King James I of England, neither of whom ever visited India. Their likenesses were copied from reproductions. But at the very bottom, we have the painter himself, Bichitr, who's proudly displaying one of the paintings that he himself has done. And of course, later on, it does become common for architects to be mentioned in the sources, the most famous of which is probably Sinan, the great Ottoman architect. This is his masterpiece, the interior of the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, dating from the second half of the 16th century. So from this period onwards, yes, we do have the name of many of these architects. But for most of the works of Islamic art, such as this magnificent winged gateway from an area we haven't looked at yet. This is actually in Java, in Indonesia, the home of over 1 billion Muslims, the most populous Islamic country. We have an example which is heavily indebted to pre-Islamic art in Indonesia. We don't know who painted this. Similarly, an example from China. Lots of Chinese lotuses, but some wonderful inscriptions. And we don't know who is responsible for the magnificent geometric design at the interior of this mausoleum of the late 14th century, also in older Gentian Turkmenistan, or this magnificent arabesque decoration in Bukhara, dating from the 14th century. But fortunately, whether you know the name of the craftsmen or not, it doesn't stop us from enjoying their works. Thank you.